when I refer to the blob, I'm referring to the foreign policy establishment's two factions that comprise it. Internally within the government, that's the State Department, the Defense Department, and the intelligence community, like the CIA and the NSA. These are all, we have an American homeland where we live, and then we have an American empire, which stretches around the world. And in a globalized economy, there's the Milton Friedman quote about the pencil, for example, and what it takes to make a pencil. And, the gums come from a tree in South America, and the graphite comes from a mine in sub-Saharan Africa, and everything that it takes to make, a simple little instrument of the economy. Well, what happens if a foreign government doesn't allow you, to basically access that supply? Or what happens if they change their labor laws to make it prohibitive to operate there? What happens if they pass a law to box out? The role of the State Department is to essentially pry open and make other governments reasonable to U.S. commercial interests. The Defense Department does that on the security side, and our intelligence services do all the little dirty work operations that are formally deniable by state or DOD. But at the end of World War II, when we set up the rules-based international order and this globalized, world that we live in today, we early out the gate in 1948 essentially declared a Department of Dirty Tricks doctrine, that we would empower our foreign policy establishment to do dirty things on the world stage to other countries for the interests of Americans, because if we didn't do it, the Bolsheviks would. So famously in 1948, George Kennan, who's one of the godfathers of the CIA, 12 days after we rigged the Italian election in 1948, wrote a CIA memo calling for the inauguration of organized political warfare, saying, we need a foreign-facing dirty tricks power, because if we don't do it, the Bolsheviks will. We need to continue to be able to control other countries' internal affairs. But the catch is, it's going to be for the benefit of the people of the homeland, and it's not going to be used on them. And the issue is we're now living in an era where the empire managers, the Blob, are using that same toolkit that was only supposed to be used abroad against their own people who are voting now under this sort of populist nationalist emergence for a policies focusing on domestic priorities rather than foreign policy. And this is essentially what Trumpism is in the U.S. It's what a lot of the populist movements in Europe are doing. It's what's happening right now in Israel with the relatively nationalist government there. They're all under, it's what happened to Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary. All of these are being targeted by the Blob for regime change and for suppression and for censorship, because they threaten essentially the economic interests of the Blob stakeholders. And just beyond the State Department, DOD, and IC, you have the corporate and financial stakeholders who draft off of the operations of the government, whose markets are pried open by them. So that's really sort of the meta story behind the construction of the censorship industry here in the U.S. and even institutions like NewsGuard.
I'd imagine that the idea that governments would try to control information is not a new thing, right? And try to spread democracy, the New York Times has been really controlling information, both here in the United States in particular and abroad. But what you're saying is that the United States would use information and communication in order to impact other countries, so much so that it would even launch into possible wars or regime changes based on impressing onto the population a certain idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. People forget how revolutionary social media really was. It was really the first time we had a free and open information economy in this country. It was not until the internet, allowed peer-to-peer communications that there was ever really a back door to escape the intermediation of the foreign policy establishment, of our empire managers in mainstream media. And I don't think they anticipated that, because the initial rollout of the internet was to promote free and open internet in other countries in order for us to have a sort of new voice of America. So more specifically, we had something called Wisner's Wurlitzer in this country. This was named after Frank Wisner, who was one of the CIA godfathers. He bragged that he could play international media like a Wurlitzer, like a long sort of piano organ, and create a symphony of news cycles around the world because of all the different media proprietaries under the CIA and State Department's control. That was essentially one of the main reasons the internet was handed over from the military. I don't think they were anticipating the day when their own citizens might have nationalist thoughts in opposition to their policies, and we would effectively become, dissidents. And that's essentially what ushered in the censorship age.
Can you explain what Graphika is? Because I think that's connected to what you're describing.
Mm-hmm. So Graphika is a company that was initially doing, it bills itself as a social media analytics firm to be able to draw. They sort of look like spherical balls of yarn, where you take any narrative that's being spread on the internet and you chunk it into nodes and links between nodes in order to create a network map of who's spreading a particular narrative. So, for example, ISIS was said to be recruiting on Facebook and Twitter in 2014, 2015. And so the State Department and the intelligence services would want to know, well, who are the main ISIS recruiters on Facebook and Twitter? And who are their sort of lieutenant class amplifiers? And how does the information spread from there? And using a technique called natural language processing, you can draw a network map of hundreds of thousands or millions of people, essentially, all rolled up into their role in the amplification of a narrative. And so Graphika was created as essentially a military contractor to help the Pentagon and the intelligence community create these kind of intelligence, political heat map radar systems in conflict zones that the military or intelligence services operate in. Then in 2016, Russiagate hit, and this conflation of foreign threats and domestic politics really came together in a big way. And Graphika was onboarded into the Pentagon's Minerva initiative, which is the formal psychological warfare research center. And the issue is Graphika essentially, went from being this foreign-facing spy agency on social media at a granular level, targeting individuals and links between individuals, to targeting U.S. citizens who were pro-Trump because the foreign policy establishment viewed Trump's Russia policy, his monkey wrench thrown in the Blob's long-term plan to seize Eurasia. They viewed that as a massive domestic threat. Basically, they were hired by the Blob to preserve the perceived legitimacy of a strange Biden victory through mail-in ballots. And then as soon as the 2020 election ended, they formed something called the Virality Project to censor COVID. And in fact, here's another really crazy aspect of Graphika. Again, Graphika is deep in that spawn of the Pentagon and CIA. Their chief strategy officer had worked for 25 years for the CIA. They'd done a lot of CIA work, in their contracting. They started censorship of COVID. According to their own documents, they said on December 16th, 2019, that's 4 days after the pneumonia-like symptoms broke out in Wuhan, a Pentagon Psychological Operations Warfare Unit partnered with NATO's Psychological Operations Center. It was called the Center of Excellence. It was set up after 2014. Were censoring and drawing these complex narrative network maps of who in the United States, who in Europe, who all around the world were accusing the COVID origins of being a military lab leak, of coming out of, sort of a Pentagon or USAID or anything that blamed the U.S. government. This was the U.S. government PSYOPs center being deployed to censor social media rumors about the role of the U.S. government. That, to me, is a very, very smoky, shall we say, set of circumstances that this is essentially the first mover in the censorship space of COVID.
How is this legal? How can our own government use social media to censor a political opponent? This just sounds like something that they obviously crossed the line, and how are they getting away with it? And I know that NewsGuard ties into this because supposedly NewsGuard is an entity that is not part of the government. They claim that they're a private entity, but we have had so many bad experiences with them when we talked about COVID, or we dare to question mail-in ballots. We have received so many threats from NewsGuard, and we have spoken to many attorneys about what our legal rights are vis-a-vis the First Amendment, and the answer has been, well, you have no legal rights because they are a private entity, and so they can do whatever they want. Can you just explain the connection between Graphika and NewsGuard, and how are they all getting away with all of this?
Mm-hmm. What we're talking about essentially here is the structuring of an intelligence operation. There are front companies and there are cutouts, and there are formally deniable links through capacity building outside organizations to do the work that the State Department wants them to do. And this is actually the birth of the CIA was about this exact thing. we created the CIA in 1947 under the National Security Act for the purpose of allowing the State Department to have plausible deniability with the cloak and dagger work that's the underside of U.S. diplomacy. In terms of the legality of it, some of this will now turn on the Supreme Court case on this. Certainly at the trial court level, it was ruled that this was not legal to do, and we know that the government did not believe that it was legal for them to do this directly. I'll give you a great example.
Are you talking about, by the way, Murthy versus Missouri?
Yes, exactly. So a great example, from that case was the censorship of the 2020 election. The Blob had wanted to park this government censorship power initially at the State Department. So what they did is they did a really cute trick. They said we have 17 intelligence agencies, only 2 of them are domestic, the FBI and DHS. Well, DHS is not attached to DOJ. DHS is its own independent equity. So you don't need suspected lawbreaking to do it there. So we are going to create a new center within DHS that will essentially combine the foreign-facing powers of the CIA on censorship in the media space with the domestic jurisdiction of the FBI, and it'll just be a fusion center within DHS. And that was what CISA was. And CISA was the main architect of censorship of Trump voices in the 2020 election. And what they did is, starting in April 2020, they got together with 4 outside entities, which would call themselves the Election Integrity Partnership. Graphika was one of the four entities there. And they said, we want to pre-censor anyone who might delegitimize an upcoming Joe Biden victory 7 months from now. But we lack the legal authorizations. The head of the Election Integrity Partnership, Alex Stamos, was on camera, and this is my organization who listened to hundreds of hours of their talks, and we clipped them on this, and it was played on the Congressional Jumbotron. DHS knew this would be illegal, so they set up an outside organization to do the dirty work. And it was a plan straight from the government to evade the First Amendment, to use a cutout, to use that same sort of structure you do for intelligence work.
So that they basically created a for-profit industry for censorship.
Yes. They argued to themselves after the 2016 election that free speech on the internet was the greatest threat to the rules-based international order, because free speech on the internet didn't just cause the Trump election, it caused Brexit in the UK. And at the time, Marine Le Pen was winning in the polls against Macron in France. They were afraid Frexit was going to happen in France. The Vox party was rising in Spain. They were afraid Spexit was going to happen in Spain. The EU would come undone, which means NATO would come undone. EU is essentially the commercial arm of NATO. That would mean there'd be no enforcement arm for the IMF and the World Bank and the international creditors. The entire rules-based international order, our democratic institutions would all be destroyed simply because people would be voting for who they wanted to on social media. So what they did in 2017 was, basically 10 months of tight consensus building between these democratic institutions in order to come up with a game plan for how to get, how to censor social media to bring the media landscape back under the control of the Blob. And specifically, the linchpin of that strategy was to kill the ability for the financial capacities of alternative media. And that meant creating an industry, a censorship industry. This is why I refer to it as the censorship industry, rather than the censorship industrial complex, or rather than, the censorship enterprise or things like this, because it really does come down to the industry of it. If you kill the ability to operate professionally as a media organization, you kill the ability to produce news stories. It's much easier. And this is what they did. They said, well, we can't stop every single bad news story, but, there's these media institutions which are the font of all this funnel. If we just go upstream and kill their ability to operate profitably, then we kill all of the opposition news stories. And this is where NewsGuard crawled out of. This is where GDI, the Global Disinformation Index, crawled out of. This is where Check My Ads and there's hundreds of these censorship mercenary firms. They're funded by the government. They're funded by the National Science Foundation. They're funded by the Defense Department. They're funded by the State Department. They're funded by USAID. They're funded by NATO organizations. They're funded by British intelligence. And it's all to kill nationalist populist news allies in order to bring social media back under the fold of the Blob.
When you talk about the economic suffocation of these media organizations, it's basically by saying advertisers will no longer advertise with these media companies, or Visa won't work and process with you anymore, et cetera, right?
That's exactly right.
Can you go back into just explain this very important case, Murthy versus Missouri? I'm not sure if all the listeners know the details, but it's a pretty significant case that's happening right now.
Yeah, I think it's the most important free speech case this country has ever had. When the El Dorado gold mine of internet censorship was discovered, and again, just to back up a second and put things in perspective, we did have a censorship apparatus domestically in this country, as we discussed. There were the CIA and the War Department and the State Department all had back channels into all of the major news distributors in this country from the 1940s until the 1990s. The power of social media censorship is it goes, even beyond killing a story at the top-down publishing level. It kills your ability to even talk about it peer-to-peer. You can't even send text messages on many of these things, for example, because WhatsApp is now under the fold of the Blob, and they've moved into encrypted, chat apps and things like this. But all communication is essentially moved online peer-to-peer. And so when you can, this ability to stop even peer-to-peer sharing of information is a power that the Blob could only dream of in the 20th century. What's at issue with this Supreme Court case is whether or not it's legal to have this censorship laundering apparatus. And what the Biden administration is arguing is that the First Amendment did not anticipate social media, and that the First Amendment, as it's classically interpreted, can no longer hold. They're essentially making the argument they make with the Second Amendment that yes, the Second Amendment may have anticipated muskets, but it didn't anticipate these high-powered rifle type things. And so the Second Amendment doesn't really apply to these high-powered automatic weapons. They're making that argument about social media that social media has overwhelmed the First Amendment, and the government needs to be able to essentially have a control mechanism over the spread of misinformation online. And the issue is if they succeed in that argument, the First Amendment is legitimately dead in this country. If there is not a constitutional check on this power, you will never have a free election in this country again.
So basically, Biden or Murthy, they're claiming that it would be just absolute anarchy. We'll have a situation where there'll be just fake news, disinformation, people just run around believing in things that are, bad and dangerous. What does Missouri claim, and why is it Missouri?
Well, because it was the state attorney general's office of Missouri and Louisiana. It was essentially an alliance of two state attorney general's offices arguing against the federal censorship structure of the federal government. So this is essentially a federalism issue. These are state attorney generals who essentially brought this suit, and there's a number of plaintiffs who are involved in this. The case initially started around COVID censorship, and the White House censorship of COVID-19, and then basically everything that was unveiled, both from my work through the Foundation for Freedom Online and through things like the Twitter files, the much larger superstructure of this whole of society apparatus, turned up, and the case expanded from being simply about federal censorship of COVID to being about federal censorship of every sensitive policy issue. Because once they got away with it for the 2020 election and COVID, they expanded this to climate, they expanded this to abortion, they expanded this to immigration, they expanded this to Ukraine. Any dissident voice on any sensitive culture policy issue, it was deemed to be an attack on critical infrastructure if you expressed misinformation online about it.
When you say they, is it Democrats, Republicans?
It is the empire rather than the homeland. It is the peoples whose jobs are in the managerial class of our international relations rather than those whose are the domestic priorities of people of the homeland. So this is a much bigger issue than Democrats versus Republicans.
Would you say that their agenda is nefarious, that it's not in the best interest of America? What is their agenda?
It is so much worse than that, I would say, because it actually ends the idea of America. The whole concept of democracy, the reason we say democracy is the most legitimate form of government over an authoritarian one, is because it's government by consent of the governed. We say that our media is civilian controlled. Our military is civilian controlled. We don't live under a military dictatorship. The military answers to the civilian run government. we determine the civilian-run government by a vote of the citizens who get our information about who to vote from citizen-run media. Well, here you have this financial stakeholder class of the Blob, all the multinational corporations, all their financial investors from the BlackRock and Vanguards of the world, and the New York, private equity firms, and London, banks, and all the investors in our corporate class, who are in bed with our military industrial complex and our energy sector and our Chamber of Commerce, to be able to have this sort of, international empire. And there was this idea that our State Department, our DOD, and our intelligence services, our FBI, our CIA, our DHS, could all move into the media space, because now Russia was threatening hearts and minds. So we need to control our own citizens' hearts and minds more than Russia does. And while we're at it, we're controlling American hearts and minds. So we're just going to bend them on who to vote for in order to make sure that they don't vote for something that opposes the foreign policy establishment's agenda. And so when you could make this argument that half the country was an insider threat, a counterintelligence threat, and that we needed to control their hearts and minds, at the military level to counter the Russian military level, well, that now means we don't have a civilian-run government anymore. That now means we don't have a civilian-run media. That basically puts the same dirty tricks departments for controlling foreign governments of our own. Well, then who's in charge of the country? How can you call that a democracy when you've got the military control over media, which means military control over the government, which means we don't consent to this government. You're not allowing us to even talk amongst ourselves in peer-to-peer communications about who to vote for.